kick off the discussion by reading something that came onto my screen earlier this week. I was obviously aware that this event was happening, and you know how it is, you're told about all kinds of other events that are happening. And there's been a series of lectures going on in London at Royal Holloway and Berger College on musical subjectivity by Eric Clark. Yeah, and he writes the following. And this is directed to you two in particular, but to everybody really, if you'd like to respond. He says, the final lecture both looks to the future of research on musical subjectivity and returns to the questions about neighbouring disciplines and different traditions of research and theorising about music and subjectivity that the first lecture raised. Rapid advances in music and neuroscience offer tantalizing prospects for understanding the cerebral basis of all kinds of musical phenomena. But, this is the large one, but the gap between a neuroscientific discourse and a phenomenological or social cultural account remains wide. A parallel to what some have referred to as the hard problem of consciousness. So, as an outsider who's not in the neuroscientific business, I was wondering whether this is something that either of you in particular are aware of. That is to say, work on music in the brain and over here, and people working on social phenomenological issues about, I guess that would mean in this case, how we generally approach music, what relationship we have to music as human beings. The extent to which there is some kind of perceived gap, firstly, and secondly, that somehow these areas of research are coming closer together.
Want to start?
If you'd like to start, go ahead.
So I'll just say two things. So one is there's a profound gap between laboratory experiments and real life. That is at the heart of all of what we do. So much of what we do in the world of auditory perception is based on ideal situations using sine tones and under laboratory conditions, and it's as distant from music as can possibly be. And the need to do that is to get to validate numerically what your results are. So on one hand, to get clean results, you have to remove yourself from real life situations. People, many of us, Dan at the lead and Kolsch and others, sort of return to these fundamental experiments with real life data and try to bridge that gap. But it's there will always be this gap, and so one really sort of needs to separate between what can be obtained systematically and where meaning is subverted, or we're attaining something that's subverted because of that. Where do you go on that?
When we were reading Eric Clark's message there, I was thinking about the hard problem of consciousness and what distinguishes humans from other species in terms of consciousness and social structure, and certainly other species like societies and social structure, ants and bees, certainly structure, and that far back. And all primates most primates are fundamentally social species. But one thing that I think is worth, and maybe obvious, but worth mentioning is that so far as we know, we're the only species that has this sort of self-awareness or metacognition and the ability to talk about talking and to think about thinking, and these things that we sort of take for granted as a hallmark of humanity. And when you talk about music and its phenomenological import in a societal sense and the consciousness sense, it makes me think about the difference in our music versus other species music. We can write songs about songs. We can make music about other music. We quote other music. In fact, jazz since 1940 is based on that. It's inconceivable that there would be, standard practice jazz.
Let alone Mozart.
Right. Right. I mean, the cleverness of the composer is often measured by the many ways in which they can quote music that you've heard before and elaborate on it and incorporate it seamlessly. So, birds can be tricked into doing these kinds of things if you give them thousands of trials and you nearly starve them and then reward them with food. But they're not doing it on their own. I think one of the hard problems of consciousness, maybe there is the hard problem of consciousness, I don't know the philosophy of mind literature well enough to know, but
It is alleged to exist.
and
The hard problem.
and what is the hard problem?
If you know everything about the nature of the brain, does that
Oh, right, the
explain
reduction
how-
problem.
Does it explain how the brain gives rise to conscious experience? So
Oh, okay.
analogously to music, let's say for some reason I spent my whole life never having heard the middle C, maybe locked on or something like that. But yet I knew exactly what the brain did when the middle C was being heard. If I then heard it, would I understand that experience? Would I know if I know would I learn something new, or would it simply tell me what I already knew from the complete brain science? That's
So
one
it's-
version of it.
This one version of it is really the qualia problem.
Yeah, it is the quality problem, is the quality problem.
Yeah.
So then, in the musical situation, I would think the analogy would be, the point of the analogy would be, if we can get all the facts about how the brain subserves the experience of a sound of music, do we then explain the music itself? Is there anything left over about the experience?
But
Or is there any, finally, like, how is it that you can get from the sorts of images that we saw, various parts of the brain having more oxygen or whatever, to the actual experience that that person is having? What kind of causal relations there?
Well, I have three quick things to say then about that. Thank you for defining the term for me better. The first thing is that in theory, I think that we can't know what experiences feel like that we haven't had, other than conjunctions or juxtapositions of prior experience. So, and I'm relying on John Locke, who said that you can't imagine a smell you've never smelled. It's not exactly what he said. That's the essence of his argument. That, as I understand it, that the subjective experience of any sensory event is based on other sensory events that you've had. You can't, and imagination is limited by what you've actually experienced. So I can imagine a pink elephant, but I've seen pink and I've seen elephants, so that's not a problem. But I can't imagine a smell I've never smelled or a note I've never heard, unless you can relate it to compositions and elements that I have. So I think that ultimately, in the example you gave, if I really knew neuroscience and I knew the neuroscience of B flat and B and C sharp and D, and then I could see the activity for C, I don't think that would tell me anything about what C sounds like, if in fact C sounds different than those other things. And the second thing I think is that I do believe, along with Paul Churchland and others, that ultimately all of conscious experience is reducible to brain activity. I'm a functionalist in that sense. That's the only reason I do neuroscience. I think it's going to tell us something. I think it's a different level of description, and I think that it's valid. I think that we probably are going to find in 10 years that 80% of the papers that have been published are wrong or misinformed, but that's the way science grows, right? So I mean, that doesn't bother me. I mean, most of what Piaget and Freud thought we now no longer believe, and that doesn't mean that you're not important. So I take that as an axiom of science, not just of neuroscience. But I'm a reductionist in the sense that I think understanding brain activity is important and that brain activity can be correlated to different emotional, experiential, and consciousness states. The third thing is that I do think, along with Dan Dennett and Chalmers and others, that consciousness does arise from just neural firings, and we don't need to resort to some sort of metaphysical or great spaghetti monster explanation for where consciousness comes from. I think it's probably an emergent property of complexity of neural firings. And the question about music, then, to bring it back to this, is that I guess that composers imagine things that they haven't heard, and that's what composition is.
But some of them compose without pianos.
Yes.
Well,
Right.
hearing versus hearing in the head, there's
Yeah.
quite good hearing in the head.
But I guess it's really a question for you as a composer. If you're really and truly hearing things that are sui generis, or whether they're compositions of elements or ideals of melody.
I don't know, but I would say that, so for me, the most fundamental act of composing is what happens when any listener taps their feet. While one listens to a piece of music, there's another piece of music that's being created on the fly, which is called the meter piece. And it's and if you think about foot tapping while we listen to music, most of those foot taps occur when there is no sound to accompany, right? And so we are literally creating this parallel piece that is recognizing some synchrony to the rhythmic metric organization. But that's an entirely creative act. And I think that that's sort of a fundamental piece of this. Do we imagine new sounds? I don't know if it's a relevant question. Right? I don't know what we can gain out of that. I do want to say one thing about the qualia issue, though, which is I think part of the problem is that we're so reliant on an assumption of naming conventions and sort of prior knowledge and understanding. So I became acutely aware of this when you think about the speech recognition world. Sort of speech recognition, speech understanding is based on 40 years of research using a representation called null frequency Kestrel coefficient. Wonderful, perceptually based representation, right? But so much effort and money and research time has gone into work that's based around this. Nobody has ever stepped away and say, maybe there's another representation that will serve us well, that will serve us better. And I think in music that's fundamentally an issue. Dan mentioned the Krumm-Hansel-Kessler key profiles before, which is at the heart of so much of the research on expectation and pitch organization, hierarchical response, and in many ways, if you presented the concept of the Krumm-Hansel-Kessler key profiles to a music theorist, they would recoil in horror because it's jumping over some assumptions about functional relationships that simply is conflating two very different aspects of hearing and listening. It also doesn't take into account this issue of silence and time, and the role of silence and expectation. So does that negate all the years of research that's been done on that? No, but it really raises a question about whether the ability to recognize C is really an issue at all. If that naming convention really has anything to do with the experience.
I did. So Dan, I want to. So I was worried that there was a certain amount of tension between your position on the missing shade of blue or the quality problem or whatever we want to call that, and your position in the other two comments in light of a position you took in the other room in your talk. And the position that you took was this and I think this is getting to what Stephen really wanted to press the two of you on. The position he took in the other room was that art is like a caricature. It doesn't convey the full information about an event that would be contained in a list of facts about it. It, you said, tells us what it felt like to be there. And that intended emotional reaction to the event seems to me like something that would fall under your first comment, the comment that you made about coming to know what it would be like subjectively, needing to depend on experience. So what does the artist give us? The artist takes us, and by manipulating our emotions, in a way by kind of ostension, using our own emotions, shows us what it was like to be there. And it seemed like you thought that was sui generis and could only be gotten by having the subjective experience. But then you wanted to say that, look, you do know everything you need to know about mental life by knowing everything there is to know about the brain. You just don't know subjectively what it feels like, something like that. But I took Stephen's point to be this: isn't that realm of artistic experience something important that would be a further fact or a further truth beyond knowing everything that there was to know about the way the brain worked before the artist took us to that place by creating that particular work and thereby showing us what subjectively it would feel like. So the question is, given your position on art being like caricature, is your first comment in tension with your second and third?
Are you asking if there's some ghost in the machine? If there's somebody inside my head that's experiencing the art that can't be reduced to neuronal firings?
No, I don't want to make any claim about the metaphysics of the person. I guess it's a question about the experience and whether, well, so maybe it gets this, maybe it gets to this. You did say in your third comment, okay, maybe the consciousness is an emergent property of the neurons. I guess I didn't think of the question as being about whether dualism is true. I thought of the question as being more modest. Is there something to the experience, the experience of the artistic character of the music
That's not reducible to neural
that
firings?
is different from all the facts about the neural basis for our capacity to experience?
Yes and no. Is the question intended for me or for Stephen? I would say yes and no.
And I'll comment as well, but you go first.
I think that with what we understand now about the brain, there's a whole lot of unexplained variance. We don't understand very much. But I think in principle, given enough time and rigorous enough studies and enough knowledge and better tools than we have, in principle, we can understand all of that subjective, ineffable, what we now call ineffable artistic experience, in principle, by looking at patterns of neural firings in the brain. That is, to me, what it means to be a materialist, a monist, as opposed to a dualist. And not there's anything wrong with dualists. Some of my best friends are dualists. I'm not one of them. And I think that we've already seen a kind of change in the last few decades in the way people think about things. So to take an extreme case, 300 years ago, if you heard voices in your head, you were an otherworldly being, you were a witch, you were drowned, or you were burned. And now if you hear voices in your head, you call it schizophrenia or something like that, and you have medication to treat it. And people now commonly talk about being depressed and needing more serotonin. These are neurochemical, neuroscientific descriptions of emotional states, of states that were previously thought to be indescribable or ineffable or unshareable or somehow outside of the realm of neural firings. Other things that we thought we couldn't explain that way. It wouldn't surprise me, and just to paraphrase Churchland, if 20 years from now, instead of saying I'm hungry, you say my framastanus is firing or something. So that's, I don't see a tension there other than that we're not there yet with the correct tools we have.
Seems to me that then you should take a different position on the Mary question that Jonathan put. So if you were locked in the room and had never heard the middle C and learned everything there is to know about the neurobiology of what's going on in middle C perception, you should take the position you know everything there is to know. There's nothing more to know when you hear
There's
it.
a directionality difference. I can account for the phenomena by looking at the brain firing, but that doesn't necessarily mean I can look at the direction, right? I can't necessarily look at the brain firings and tell you what it would feel like to have that experience if I've never had the experience before. It's not necessarily bi-directional. Now, maybe I'm contradicting myself.
Well, if
I don't
somebody
think so.
left out an explanation, I mean, that the complete explanation of the phenomenon of the note C would need to account for what it was like to hear. So that ultimately places a kind of limit on the reduction, which means that
Fair enough.
that there's a.
I take
Maybe I could just chime in very quickly on this, because I think what Jonathan said about the lab conditions is really interesting and quite pertinent. Going back to the comment about cheesecake and Pinker, I don't think Pinker's wrong, but I don't think he's wholly right either. That is to say, for him, he has a certain image of music, he has a certain kind of music in mind, and is making a generalization about music, calling it all cheesecake. Well, it might be a fair observation about certain listening habits. By the same token, going back to the lab condition, so in a way you could say that Pinker's idea about music as cheesecake is his aesthetic prejudice. And there are all these people in the audience saying, he's wrong, well they've got their aesthetic prejudices as well, but they're just not in accord with his. The lab conditions, can't one call those aesthetic prejudices as well? That is to say, in this case, there's a particular idea about how we experience music, and it's being measured. And I suppose music is particularly prone to this because it is the art of time. It's being measured as a temporal experience, and one is measuring the firings of the brain over a period of time. It's not that different in a way from how people think about going to a concert and listening to a piece of music. You sit down, you get quiet, like in a laboratory. We have no visual, well, we have some visual restrictions, sure. If we're real listeners, we close our eyes and feign prayer or something like that. And it's all about this music going in and doing something to it, and at the end we finish. But one could come up with all kinds of people who would object to that. There was, Jonathan and I talked about this before, there was a aesthetician in the 19th century called Levitin, who would have said measuring what people's brains doing in response to oral stimuli is a kind of pathological way of listening to music. What he was interested in was what he called the aesthetic way of listening. So he distinguished quite categorically between the kind of cheesecake stuff, maybe, and proper listening to music, which involved following the musical logic and having a conception of the organic whole of the piece of music, something that you would then take away as a representation of the totality of the music in your brain after you had heard it. And there were subsequently then musical analysts who tried to represent the totality of the music visually. Heinrich Schenker is the best example. In fact, he wanted Hanslick's job in Vienna. I thought he could do a better job than Hanslick by actually coming up with a notational representation of music. That surely is also a question of musical consciousness, and I'm not sure how one could come up with a lab condition for measuring that. Yes. Sorry, I think, in fact, you were first, then you, and then Kim, and then Josh.
Is the you me?
Yes, you can
Well,
start.
yeah. I had a question about expectation, this idea that expectation is music appreciation. Because when I first actually read that in the thing that was distributed, I thought it might connect what we were talking about this morning, where tracking, where you track a fiction, and because we're good trackers, we're also good at tracking what's going on in a fictional plot and so on. But then, I don't know, this is reporting my subjective appreciation of music and of, by contrast with how I appreciate fictions, repeated listenings, repeated readings, repeated going to a movie. Perhaps others share this. When I see a movie twice or many times, I allow myself to be. I'm able to be surprised again, and lots of people report this. We have this ability to lose ourselves again in the fiction, even though at some level we know what's going to happen next. But we wouldn't enjoy it the way we do if we spent our time, you know what's happening. I know exactly what's coming next, and that would kind of interfere, and we tend to block that out. And the opposite happens with music. So I kind of agree with you.
Wait.
Why the opposite?
What, you don't
Allow me to
about
explain.
that one?
This is my thought anyway, which is when if there's a piece of music that I really enjoy, the first time I hear it, it may be because it surprised me and swept me away. But then the next time I hear it, I'm waiting to be swept to that same exact place, and it is so that when it happens, when that climax happens, it's like, yes, he did it again. He brought me there again, and I'm waiting for that to happen. I'm absolutely so far from being surprised by that. The pleasure that I derive from the repeated listening to the music is, he's getting me there by making that very thing happen that I am waiting for, and it's because I know it's going to happen, that increases the pleasure, which is the opposite of what happens with fictions and novels and movies and stuff.
At the risk of disagreeing with you,
Go ahead.
I suspect that what's happening is that there's a level of surprise that's going on that you're not consciously aware of. Jonathan and I have talked about this, and a kind of ready, handy example from the pop music domain is the Beatles song Yesterday. So Yesterday uses 7 bar phrases. Now you've probably heard this song even if you're not a Beatles fan, and even if you don't listen to pop music. I'm willing to bet everybody's heard this song hundreds or thousands of times. It's one of the most recorded songs in musical history. Second, maybe only in terms of number of playings, to Happy Birthday. Anyway, it's 7 bar phrases. You're not surprised at this point when you hear the transition between bar 7 and bar 8 or bar 1 of the next phrase. You're not surprised in the literal sense, but you're schematically surprised. It flies in the face, no matter how many times you've heard it, of the tens of thousands of other songs you've heard with 8 bar phrases. So if you think of this in terms of memory mechanisms and what's accepted as the multiple trace theory of memory, that everything you experience lays down a trace in your memory somehow, you've got this instantiated schema for the 8-bar pop song. And Yesterday flies in the face or contradicts that schema over and over again. You're waiting for that wonderful moment. You know it's coming. It doesn't surprise you in the literal local sense. It surprises you in the larger schematic global sense as a juxtaposition to all the other things. And I would extend that point to harmony and to melody and to rhythm and all the other micro surprises we have with music, that they're occurring relative and in contrast to schematic expectations you have from music at large.
Right, but the difference remains that I accept that, and that the surprise you're talking about is what makes it such a good song. But the difference remains phenomenologically that it's because I am expecting what's going, and so I'm waiting for it, and it comes as expected, that it gives me that pleasure on rehearings, which is not what happens with re-engagement with mimetic fiction like movies, novels, and the like.
How would one verify that?
I'm saying that that's my subjective experience. Has no one else had this?
That's such a foreign concept to me.
Because I'm thinking by analogy when I see Chaplin and he's about to slip on a banana peel. I see the banana peel there. I know he's going to slip, and I'm waiting for it to happen. And yet it's still surprising in some sense. I mean, I find it with movies myself that I have that experience you're saying you don't have with movies. So I don't know what other people have.
This isn't my question, but aren't you asking just, or isn't it possible to ask a simpler question, which is not my question, which is, there's some music that you like better the more familiar it is to you, and so what's up with that? Why is it that you have to learn, let's say, more difficult music in order to appreciate it rather than liking it on the first hearing?
So I think one of the problems is we're generalizing listening as this singular act. There are numerous types of listening, and we listen in many different ways, sometimes overlapping. So we have music students typically do fault listening before anything else. They're listening for errors. We're listening for landmarks. We're listening for imagery. We're listening for to repeat an experience. We're listening for an external reference or so. There's so many types of listening, and the act of listening through a piece of music is a very active and fluid one. I think it makes this question very, much more almost unanswerable.
Okay, that actually does feed into my question, which is, so there's stuff that I'm working on in poetry, and in particular rhymed and formal poetry, and this has to do with or is prompted by the things that you were saying about expectation. So there's a really interesting way that the more formal the poetry, and light verse is actually the best example of this kind of thing, because light verse is always the most formal kind of poetry there is. Telegraphs where it's going. If the limerick begins, there was a young man from Nantucket, no one is surprised. And yet, the whole point about light verse or something like a limerick is that the punchline should come unexpectedly. So on the one hand, there's the expectation, you know where it's going, and on the other hand, and you really know where it's going. And on the other hand, the pop of surprise, which is what light verse of that sort trades in, really has to happen. And it's also, I think, I don't know that this is true in non-Indo-European, but it seems to be a general rule in Indo-European meter, which is the rule of loose onsets and strict endings. That is that lines of poetry are much more constrained at their endings than at their beginnings, metrically. Which also means that there's a sense in which no matter how much a line wobbles at the start, it's going to fall into a pattern and an expected pattern at the end. So you have a kind of expectation about expectation. And what light verse does, and I sort of want to generalize this as much as I can, I mean, not today, but as a life project. What light verse does frequently is it surprises you about where the surprise is. That is, you see where you're going, you see where it's going to end, but you don't know how it's going to get there. And there's also a kind of temporal, actual lived temporal experience which is going on, which is you're sort of trying, like in joke telling, you're trying to outrace the poem that is getting to the punchline at a pretty fast clip, and you're trying to guess how it's going to do it when you know where it's going. You try to guess how it's going to do it before you actually get to where it's doing it. Now, that's a standard way, so this also goes back to classics, or one really interesting way to do it is through unexpected rhetorical moves, so that something that will frequently happen is you'll have zeugma, as a way of doing it. You'll think that grammatically you're looking at one thing that can't possibly lead to the end word that you're also anticipating. And so it's as though the poem is able to juggle temporally, or the line is able to juggle temporally, two different things, both of which are sending you off as a reader or as an auditor in two different directions. But then it turns out, and this interestingly gets in content, which may be more irrelevant to people thinking about music, but it turns out that something that you thought was literal is now going to be a scheme or a figure of speech or a figure of thought, or something that you thought was going to be a figure of speech turns out to be literal. So, but part of what's going on, which is, I guess my question is, isn't this interesting? But part of what's going on is that it's not only the way expectation is playing out over the temporal unfolding of the poem, but also the surprise as to where it is that you think that expectation will be violated or not violated.
Completely agree. I completely agree. And I think that you talk about verse and then you talk about delivery. And so the performance of a written score is really what is really the experience of music. The written score is just a bunch of black notes on paper that give some very vague directives, right? Mm-hmm. And so that score has a quantized view of what happens over time. It's all, Western tradition, and it's boxed into these little units. Partly for, and in fact, notation is very intricate, has evolved to be, Western notation, has evolved to be this very intricate confluence of iconic and symbolic representation. At best, it gives a performer a set of, a starting point. And the performance is really about the micro-time changes, and sometimes not so micro-time changes. And that, in fact, is where the early and late distortions of time really do have a direct analogy in the performance. Yeah, I think, and in fact, I think there's also a direct analogy to the
So 1, 2, 3, but Dan wants to follow.
Yeah, I also agree with what you said about the where, the expectation. One comment I have is that certainly in classical music, symphony, we know what note it's going to end on, or what chord it's going to end on. It's the how they get there. It's the I didn't know he could get there that way. That's the interesting part. Of course, the sort of false ending is just an instantiation of that. You know it's coming. You just don't know, how they're going to get there. The other thing I wanted to follow up on is, as Jonathan and Stephen alluded to earlier, I had a symposium somewhat like this with Paul Simon, the songwriter, last week, and I was asking him how he writes songs. And there were other professional songwriters in the audience, people who had a number of hits with, Britney Spears and the Jonas Brothers. But I mean, writing hits for those groups is not trivial. And there was another songwriter who had written the theme from Sex and the City, the television theme, which is very well known, and had done a bunch of film scoring. And another songwriter who had, people who write 9 to 5 and their job is to write top 10 hits. And they were astonished, they told me afterwards, at what Paul said, because it goes against the wisdom about how to write songs. When he writes a song, he just starts writing. First he does all the music and the chords and the rhythm, all that's done, and then he adds the lyrics. And setting the lyrics aside, as he's writing his chords and his rhythms, he'll get a few notes in and he'll stop himself and he'll say, what is it that should come next? And he'll shy away from that. What can I put here that doesn't fit? Now, one of the points where Jonathan raised his hand in Kodachrome, you hear this sort of overworked cliche, one of the oldest blues licks we've got, and it comes from out of nowhere in this song. And he just thought, that's the thing you least expect at this moment. I'm going to stick it in there. People like this rhythm. I like this rhythm. I used it, in Mrs. Robinson, and I used it in a couple other plays. I'm going to stick it in there. But I'm not going to stay with it. I'm going to come right off of it and go somewhere else. So it's a very deliberate sort of approach to, I don't know where I'm going, but wherever I'm going, it's not going to be where you think or where I thought it was going to go. And I had a similar conversation with Sting, who says that he'll intentionally write himself into a corner, the compositional equipment of painting himself into a corner, where he's sure he won't be able to get out. And he'll write himself into a set of constraints so that he really feels stuck, and then spend however long it takes, days or weeks, trying to figure out how to get out of that little corner. And if he can pull that off, he knows that he's got a song that's going to be rewarding. And there's this aspect of the puzzle, or the maze, that both of these people were talking about, which I think is really extraordinary. And I don't know that much about compositional processes of the great masters, but I wonder if to some extent they set themselves up with similar challenges to overcome.
Thank you. I now know that Sting has a second name. It's Houdini.
See if I can tie the last 2 or 3 comments together to my question. I'm a poet guy, I'm not an English, I'm not a music person, but it seemed to me that for a long time, it seemed to me that the question of the relationship between the actual sound of a line of poetry and the underlying metrical space in which it exists is almost useless as an explanation for the value, the aesthetic or content value of the poem. It's particularly true in English poetry because our inheritance of the poem is the iambic line, the pentameter line has really got 4 stresses on it generally, and it's a very screwed up system. It doesn't start off with a classical system of 5. Which gets me to the second point, which I deeply understand about linguistics, which is that it's been shown, I think, that there is not a single synoptic, representation in the brain for a word. That a word in the brain will show up in many, many different kinds of ways, in many, many different kinds of spaces, depending upon its context. And therefore, it's not possible to do a functional mapping between speech and brain things on a word-by-word basis. It has to be moved into a much larger space in order for us to say this word has this representation in the brain. Which gets me to my second analogy, and the distinction I'd like to ask you about. When we talk about a building, there are lots of ways of talking about a building. The way we talk about a building aesthetically has a tendency to talk about its much larger structures. It seems to me that you're asking the business of aesthetics relative to the brain, without getting into any of the questions of ontology, to say, well, we can reduce the aesthetic properties of the brain to a full description of its atomic structure. And it seems to me that there are 2 problems with that. One is that we may know actually all the laws about the atomic structure, but we could never fully describe the atomic structure of any given building. And so in some respects, the fact that we have a theory about it, how it might work, has no value to how its particular specific aesthetic experience operates in any given particular brain, because we could never measure it. There's a Heisenberg problem, a chaos theory problem. There's just too many things in there to actually get hold of. But secondly, if we ask ourselves the business about the relationship between descriptions and explanations, we have a descriptive space, and if we're asking a reductive process to actually operate, we should be able to reduce that descriptive space to the secondary descriptive space and be fully explanatory relative to the phenomenon that we experience. And that seems to me to be not incorrect. And I think that we will always describe buildings in beautiful ways, and we're never going to go around and say the building is equal to this cubic feet of molecules on the bottom that represents the concrete that was put in by this thing. And that relative to my first point about the brain, most of our descriptive systems are always contextualized by something. They exist in some atmosphere, usually by interest. We talk about a building relative to building codes, we talk about a building relative to concrete, relative to contractors. It never exists all by itself. And I think the same problem is going to happen when we try to take the phenomenon of music, incredibly complex phenomenon, and ask it to be reducible as a phenomenon that can be fully explained to matters of the brain itself. And I don't think that touches, and it doesn't have to get you into the question of dualism, two ontologies, Platonism. It really has to do with the rhetorical structure of how we treat phenomena and what we're able to do scientifically to move the various descriptive structures around.
I think your building example relates to Jonathan's example about notation versus performance.
Very much.
So, and it relates to your question about reductionism. So, I can completely describe Beethoven's Ninth by showing you the score. It's deterministic in a sense, but I can't describe what it feels like to hear it. There are only very few people who can actually look at the score and have an aesthetic experience from it. Maybe Tuscany. Most people need to hear it. And similarly with the building, I can show you the blueprints to the building, and I can show you in the brain where the activity would occur if you were to look at the blueprints or look at the building itself. But that's not a substitute for actually seeing the building. Look at it as it isn't a substitute for actually hearing the score, right?
So that actually brings me to my question. Should I ask it or?
You're next.
I mean,
Then I've registered you, then I've registered Beverly, and then I should probably draw a line under this part of the session because I know we're moving into a coda in which there's going to be discussion not only about what we've just been talking about, but some kind of wrap up of the whole day. So Jeff,
If I may, I'm sure it'll tie in. I was just wondering, in the early discussion, a mischievous question came, which is, isn't emergence just the poor man's dualism? Or secular man's dualism? I mean, what's the difference? I mean, because really, when we talk about emergent properties, we're saying that object X described at level A looks qualitatively different from object X described at level B. Now, and you can't, in a sense, you can't get from one field. So if you look at the molecular level, it's qualitatively different. And if you go to the subatomic level, it's qualitatively different again. So okay, we don't have a ghost in the machine. We don't have something like an immortal soul. But isn't it? I mean, in relation to the question that's currently on the table,
Are you a
might as well
philosopher?
have. No, I just put on TV. No, I just hang out with philosophers. So I mean, it ultimately doesn't it make us dualists in a sense? I mean, we're talking about a distinction, a real distinction between brain states and qualia, and might as well be a dualist.
You can't be a dualist, you have to have an infinite set of structures.
Well, true, more than dualist.
I'm reluctant to get into a battle of wits with philosophers and with you because I fear I'm hopelessly unarmed here. But to me, it comes down to how one defines what it means to be a dualist. And by my, perhaps layperson's or outsider's conception of things, a dualist believes in metaphysical or non-physical explanations for things. And there are, of course, dualists who accept some sort of version of epiphenomenalism, but I think the kind of emergence I'm talking about is still consistent with physical principles, maybe not yet fully understood, but I'm not looking for an explanation outside of science, and so I would say that it's still materialism.
Let me just add that I think there's a huge amount of impatience in all of these comments. I mean, this is a field of study that's in its infancy. And the expectation that it's going to produce deep understanding, we're so far from it. And it's a long road, and in order to get there, one has to begin to sort out all of these things. There are two other issues here. One is that, so I'm very interested in music. The phenomenon of music that's just in the background, and with the exception of loudness, correct me if I'm wrong, David, with the exception of perceptual studies of loudness, which is way up there in the world of perception study, the study of music, the sort of psychological study of music over the last 100 years, probably outdoes all other studies because there was a lot of money in it, because it was purposeful. And so what is music? Music is the careful control the disassociation of arousal and attention, and the careful manipulation of one at the expense of the other. And so if I look at this as a composer, right, if I ever want to measure how big a surprise I'm going to put by doing this, right, that's sort of the silly ideal, is I want a little surprise meter when I write, right? If I'm ever going to go in that direction, I need to understand this funny relationship between attention and arousal. Will that give us deep knowledge about the art of music? Maybe, not in my lifetime. But it's these first steps that will take us there.
So this goes back to the question about surprise from that end of the table, the response saying, well, in some sense, you still end up surprised. So I won't use yesterday because it doesn't suit my examples, but for my purposes, but rather, so there's a song for Dobo by John Campbell, that I like a lot, that towards the end, it's like a 5-minute pop song, towards the end, there's some listening chords, and I like that part of it. I look forward to hearing those in the context, and that's not what I listen to. And unlike with yesterday, not only do I know that that's coming, but I am aware this is unusual for a pop song. But I would not have known this, but yesterday's the 7 bar subject. I'm perfectly okay with the suggestion as to why I appreciate it. That runs along lines suggesting that, well, this is unusual relative to this sort of kind of music, so it sticks in your memory more, and you are sort of implicitly comparing it with other pop songs when you listen to it, etc. I don't see why I should go along and say, and this counts as being surprised by it also, in any sense. I know, I'm listening because I want to hear this thing, I know it's coming, and I know that what I'm going to hear is something that is relatively uncommon. So I think you can get some mileage out of the subconscious surprise when it's not something that you are explicitly aware of. Maybe a naive listener doesn't know this about yesterday. And you wonder, why does the song stand out for us? But I know that the song stands out for us for this reason.
I don't see those as contradictory. So you hear an anomaly, you identify it as an anomaly. By nature of the term anomaly, it's a surprise, right? And you're appreciating the surprise on the basis of knowing that this is anomalous. This is, it's hearing the same joke over again and knowing the punchline and still waiting for the punchline. This is at the heart of music listening.
Well, yes, I know that it's anomalous, but I don't think that so surprise has, well, if I say expectation, you're going to say the same thing back again, but it just doesn't seem like this matches up with the real surprise where you heard it for the first time, like where did that come from?
There's a natural understanding of surprise in other contexts where one of the ingredients needs to be the abrupt overcoming of a piece of ignorance. And talk of musical surprise and other kinds of epistemic talk that come up in description of musical experience, deceptive cadences and so forth, involve cutting off epistemic-looking notions at what can feel in other contexts like their epistemic roots, and it's an interesting and peculiar feature of the way epistemic talk figures in the description of musical experience.
Sure, then this patient.
This is more of what you think just briefly. So there's this short little essay by Kyle Gann, which he is writing about he's comparing himself favorably to Brian Fairclough, basically, and saying that the latter is an ungenerous composer because he doesn't give the audience repetition, things that belong to. And he tries to illustrate this in film music. I think there's this piece of his, Cosmo Sitting Bull, in the second movement, one part gets repeated wholesale, and everyone at performances of it, audience members come up and talk to them, all they say that that's the part they like the most. So I'm just wondering if this seems, well, that seems interesting to me. Certainly you don't expect it to come back, but when it comes back, if it is entire, and you might think that there's more surprises and perhaps more to appreciate in pieces where nothing like that happens, because everything that happens is, in a sense, surprising.
So, well, first of all, I think that's a gross misrepresentation of his movie.
Well, I'm misrepresenting his misrepresentation.
Well, okay, so that's number one. But let me put a little bit of historical context on this. So there's this interesting moment at the turn of the 20th century where Gestalt psychology is burgeoning. And what is Gestalt psychology is data reduction. It's the need for understanding perceptual data reduction. Right? So we group things, we make sense of this complex world by putting things together into smaller units. Right? Well, I find it interesting that in the art world, soon after that, if not simultaneous, people like Marcel Duchamp came along and took a urinal and puts it out of context and takes this inherently unified and simple thing and creates this enormous litany of questions and complexity. It's the polar opposite from the purpose of the Gestalt psychologist, right? And I'll also, there's this wonderful page in Leonardo's notebooks where he talks about sitting in his room at the end of the day and just staring into his wall that's speckled with plaster, and doing what I used to do with my daughter all the time before she fell asleep, which is tell stories that find groupings, find what you see. And he would talk about seeing the horses and seeing the armies and seeing this. We have this amazing capacity to create simplicity out of complexity and to group things, but we also have this enormous human capacity to create complexity when it's not really a necessity. And this is part of the big differentiation that we really didn't touch upon, and we won't. And this is not an area that cognitive neuroscience and music is going to get to for an awfully long time.